Okay, I'm now on the second half of chapter 17. Come on, said Winter in his quiet voice. We're going to the top. For one last long moment, Franz wavered. Then he turned abruptly and went to his own tent. He laced his boots and got his axe and pack and rope, and returning to where Winter waited, he tied them both onto the rope and tested the knots. We will go slowly, my captain, he said. Slowly and carefully, and when you are tired, we will rest. Winter nodded. Franz studied the rocks above, chose his route, and began to climb. There was bare stone, then patches of snow, then stone again. The gradient was not too steep, the going not difficult, but at the height which they had now reached, the air was so thin that they gasped and panted at every step. Every few minutes they paused and leaned motionless on their axes, breathing deeply, and at intervals, as on the previous day, Winter broke out in fits of coughing. But after each brief rest, he was again ready to go on, and when Franz turned and looked at him questioningly, he nodded and murmured, "All right." It was not, as Franz had feared, a matter of hauling up a bundle of firewood. For the Englishman, though through the sheer force of his will, had made a remarkable recovery, and the guide was now having his troubles too. Mountain man though he was, he had never before been so high. Already, with perhaps 1,000 feet to go, the summits of the surrounding peaks were well below them, and it seemed they were no longer in the Earth's atmosphere at all, but in the blue ether of outer space. They climbed on. The tents vanished below them. Soon, through the distortion of distance, the broad, snow-covered shoulder appeared as far beneath them as the glaciers and valleys. There was no wind, only stillness and space, and minute by minute space grew brighter, bluer, until at last there was a great golden glow and the sun was cushioned on the ranges to the east. There was a chimney, slabs, a crag, more slabs. Then they came to a long strip of snow, and here they stopped again, staring down at the footprints in its surface. There were two sets of prints, one large, one small, and both bore straight up the snow and vanished among the rocks above. They craned upward, but saw nothing. They tried to shout, but only a hoarse croaking came out from their throats. Then they were coughing, this time not only Winter, but Franz as well. They leaned forward, heads bent against their axes, until their breathing eased. Then they moved on again. Above the snow, there was a stretch of more difficult climbing, and they moved one at a time while the others belayed the rope. Beyond this was more snow, more footprints. And still farther on, a steep pitch of ice-coated rock. Franz climbed it first, very slowly, very cautiously, then turned at the top and held the rope for Winter. "Easy now, watch it," he said. "I can do it," said the Englishman. And then the only sounds were the deep rasp of his breathing and the scraping of his boot nails against the ice and rock. The top of the pitch marked the end of the particular section of the peak on which they had been climbing. Standing side by side, they looked at the awesome prospect ahead. Directly before them, the mountain narrowed. Its cliffs and buttresses seemed to fall away, to vanish, and all that was left was a thin ridge twisting on into space. The slanting of the ridge was not steep, considerably less steep indeed than the stretch over which they had just come. But on either side, the walls dropped off almost vertically into the immense chasms of the north and east faces. For perhaps 100 feet, that was all there was, a saw edge of rock, a catwalk in the sky. Then the mountain broadened again. Mighty ribs of granite flared up from the abyss and joined together to form the base of a solid pyramid. It was a snow-covered pyramid, huge, symmetrical, gleaming. It rose in a gentle slope to the white point in the sky and ended in the summit of the citadel. The two men stopped. They sat on a slab and rested. Above them the sun, now well on in its morning journey, burned like a great eye in a blue-black space. And around and beneath them the world of the Alps spread in a vast panorama of peaks, glaciers, and valleys. There was no cloud nor even a shred of mist. Every major summit of the range stood up clear and glittering in the crystal light. To the west, in distant France, the dome of Mont Blanc seemed to fill half the horizon. To the north and east rose the tall hosts of the Swiss Pennies in the Oberland, Monte Rosa, the Dom, the Weisshorn, the Jungfrau, and scores of others, incredibly white and vivid against the blue immensity of sky. Beyond them, the land rolled away endlessly toward Germany, toward Austria, to the south, for uncounted miles across the plains of Italy. But it was not at the world beneath them that the two men looked. It was at the narrow, slanting ridge that lay ahead, and at the shining pyramid beyond the ridge. The side of the pyramid was a smooth slope of unbroken snow, and from the distance at which they saw it, any moving shape should have been visible. But they saw no shape, no movement. In the white stillness, there was no sign of the two climbers who had gone before them. They did not speak. Whatever their private thoughts may have been, they kept to themselves. Perhaps Saxo and Rudy had circled to the far side of the peak. Perhaps they were resting and hidden by a drift. One thing certain was that they were up there somewhere. Or else they sat in silence. They got up, they went on, Franz leading, Winter following. They inched out onto the spine of the narrow ridge. It was climbable, of that there was no question, but it was also a tightrope no more than a foot in width. One slip, one misstep to either side, and they would have been twisting in space for a fall of a vertical mile. Franz moved and Winter belayed. Winter moved and Franz belayed. They got a third of the way across, halfway, two-thirds of the way. Only 10 yards or so separated them from the base of the pyramid when suddenly Franz stopped. For a long moment he stood motionless, looking at something at his feet. Then he gestured and Winter came up behind him. The two stared at the knapsack that lay before them on the ridge. A roughly cut staff was lashed to its straps. Crouching, Franz opened the pack. It contained only one item, an old red flannel shirt. The men's eyes met, held, broke away. Instinctively, they looked down into the emptiness on either side of the ridge. To the left, above the east face, was a smooth vertical wall. To the right, another wall, not quite vertical, slanting down to a narrow ledge some 20 feet below. But the ledge was empty, and beneath it to the north face dropped away so steeply that it could not be seen. Franz stood as if stunned, frozen. But Winter's face was clouded with thoughts that struggled in his mind. No, Franz, he said at last. He didn't fall. He couldn't have. The guide looked at him numbly. If he'd fallen, the pack would still be on his back. How could he have taken it off first? But think of it. It's impossible. That he took off the pack and then fell? Winter's voice was hoarse and strained. No, he didn't fall. He took it off and went on. He decided he could climb better without it, and he left it here to be picked up on the way down. Franz thought it over, and hope kindled in his eyes, for what the Englishman had said was well reasoned. Yes, he murmured, that is possible. He could have. Then he paused. He was again looking at the pack, and slowly he shook his head. No, he said, no. He pointed at the staff, at the red shirt. These he carried the whole way up the mountain, the whole way from Kurtal, and we know why he carried them. He would not leave them here. There was a silence, and Winter started to speak and stopped. Then at last he muttered, still, he couldn't have fallen. It doesn't make sense. Nor does the other, said Franz. They stared dumbly at the pack, at the ridge, at the gulfs of space beside the ridge, and at the white crest of the citadel that rose beyond it. They raised their heads and shouted, but there was only the croaking of their own voices and then silence. They shouted again, and still there was silence. They must be ahead, said Winter. They must be. Franz said nothing, but after a moment moved slowly forward. The Englishmen started to follow, then paused and looked once more at Rudy's pack. Wait, he said. Stooping, he took out the red shirt and tied it around his waist. He unfastened the staff from its bindings and secured it to his own pack. All right, he said, and they moved on. And that's the end of chapter 17.